Hello again, Key Stage 5. Today we're going to be looking at Porphyria's lover. This was originally titled Porphyria. This is actually the woman's name that's referenced in the poem, but it also has links to a disease that caused hallucinations and, in some cases, even psychosis. As we go through the poem, we'll realise the significance of that, as the voice itself doesn't seem to be wholly grounded in reality and may, in fact, be considered, in some respects, insane. Some critics also think Porphyria might link to the colour purple, which is a colour associated with nobility, and as we learn later on through the poem, Porphyria, the character, the woman in the poem, is of a higher class than the speaker and may in fact be of a noble class. And the fact that it's now titled Porphyria's lover has that sexual connotation that, again, is reiterated throughout the poem. So the poem itself starts with a scene setting section. It kind of looks at the weather. The fact that it looks at this kind of rural image may be a reference to earlier romantic poetry. Some of Browning's early poems had a very Percy Bysshe Shelley kind of feel to them. They weren't particularly successful. His later dramatic monologues were much more famous, but it may be why he's included this weather, this sublime nature kind of image comes through, the image of rural simplicity. The pathetic fallacy throughout personifies the weather, but it makes the weather seem violent or aggressive. Look at those verbs in there: tore, vex, that kind of violent and aggressive choice. And the noun there, spite. This idea that the weather itself is spiteful. It could be a reflection of the speaker's personality and how he himself is kind of feeling spiteful. And then at the end, I listened with heart fit to break. He seems as though he is struggling emotionally right from the off, and that is linked to the weather. And then we shift there on line 6, when glided in Porphyria. And that glided, that choice of verb, implies elegance or beauty. We may see this as the madness that starts to set in with the man, but it's obviously on a literal level the woman who comes to see him. And this Porphyria comes in and she shuts out the cold, she shuts out the storm, and she makes a fire. So we've got there this symbolic, these visual images, these symbolic images of this woman coming in and shutting out the anger and the concern and the worry, quite literally the weather, and making it warm and light. Perhaps she's removing his unhappiness, perhaps she's bringing in some sense of love for him. The fact that the grate starts out cheerless, that misery and upset, and then blazes up into warmth. Those choices there of adjectives and verbs are really quite important in emphasising her role. And the first thing after creating the warmth that she does is start to remove her cloak and her shawl, her gloves. We may have here this kind of sexual image starting to come through right from the off. She starts to remove certain elements of her clothes, the soiled gloves, because she's been out and about. She's having sort of a social engagement at the time. She's at some sort of party or some sort of gathering of socially higher people. And what we see here is the first mention of her hair. The damp hair falls. He uses, Browning, in this poem, a lot of evaluative and colour adjectives. They're used to describe her all the way through. Her shoulder is smooth and white. Her hair is damp or yellow. So it's very close physical description of the woman, which may link, of course, to the sexuality. I'll also like to point out to you here the use of polysyndeton, this idea of and laid her, and last, and made her, and all her, and stooping, and spread. Repeating those conjunctions at the start of the lines. And if you listen to the poem and that repetition of and, it kind of sounds almost anxious and obsessive, like the speaker himself. And she did this, and she did that. There's a point here on line 15, and called me, where Browning's used caesura there. We get the idea that the speaker can hear her talking but is almost refusing to answer. Perhaps he's sulking, perhaps he's making her work for his attention. Is there a sense of jealousy because she's been out with her high-class social group and he's not part of that? Is he trying to make her work for it? Is it a control thing? We don't know, we can only interpret. Line 17, we've got this overtly sexual action. Victorian prudishness was kind of a backlash against a lot of Victorian writing. People think that the Victorians were very sort of anti-sex and didn't want to include that in their literature or their art. That's not strictly true. There was a bit of a backlash against the art and the works of literature that had references to sexual action within them. And that was where that kind of prudishness came from. Here we've got this idea throughout the whole poem of the female seduction, the power of that, and the fact that she here has the agency. She makes her shoulder bare. She displaces her yellow hair. I also want to point out at this stage the repetition of her yellow hair, the repeated phrase. Hair is constantly focused on here. What we know is that that's a hint at his obsession with her physicality, but also we learn later on that it does in fact become his murder weapon of choice. So it's kind of got a lot of emphasis. Once we know the whole poem and we understand that, we see that that yellow hair is very, very important. On line 21, she's leaning on him and she's made him lean on her. Made my cheek lie there. So she's taken the control and the agency here, and she murmurs how much she loves him. That murmuring, which is a very phonesthetic word to be fair, has a sign of softness to it. Is there a sense here that she has real affection and real love for him? Quite quiet, quite thoughtful, perhaps very genuine. She, too weak for all her heart's endeavour to set its struggling passion free, it almost starts to have here a judgmental tone. He calls her too weak. Perhaps he's saying she's too weak to leave her high society position, the safety of her vainer ties. She won't sever those and hand herself over to this poor man. Poor in the monetary sense of the word. This poor man forever. Rather, she will go back to her safety net, and that in fact he almost sees her as maybe a little bit pathetic or a little bit weak for not being able to follow her heart's desire. And the fact that he says, give herself to me forever, shows this desire to have complete ownership of her. When we know the poem, we know that foreshadows the choice he makes to kill her and kind of pose her as if alive. It's almost like he's taking control of her. Line 27, nor could tonight's gay feast restrain a sudden thought of one so pale for love of her. She was somewhere feasting, somewhere celebratory, somewhere happy, that gay feast, that even this happy and celebratory place that she was in couldn't hold her from him. He's the one who is so pale. He's pale because he loves her. He's physically impacted by that love and the fact it's almost unrequited. She loves him, but she can never be with him. He's almost fading away. But there's also there again this hint of madness and this hint of obsession coming through. Line 31, he looks up into her eyes. So I read this could be read for me in two ways. This idea that it's her eyes that are happy and proud, as in she's happy and proud to be with him, or that he might be happy and proud when at last he realises that she worships him. Because of the nature of that enjambment, it does tie to her eyes, but then the caesure and the flow there perhaps allows us to read it in a couple of different ways. At last I knew Porphyria worshipped me. That choice there of verb I find really interesting. He doesn't say loved me. He says worshipped, implying him having some sort of superiority or control or power there, almost like he's a god or an idol to her. And then he says, surprise made my heart swell. Is he shocked by her genuine feeling? Does he doubt himself? Is that where this madness lies? Because he doubts her feeling because she will not separate herself from her high-class bindings and ties to society. Now, interestingly, there's a switch here. While I debated what to do, he thinks about this. The fact that it's debated means that he makes a choice here. This is not something that's done accidentally. That moment she was mine, fair, perfectly pure and good. The mine there, that possessive pronoun, really emphasises the sense of ownership, and he repeats that, mine. So it's clearly something very important to the speaker, to the voice of this poem. The woman has little power here, and he feels a bit like he owns her. So very close in meaning really to My Last Duchess, where he repeats my and how almost creates an object out of her. Fair, perfectly pure and good, this triplicate structure. He freezes her in the most perfect moment. Okay, so she's not being cast out by her family for indiscretion at this point. She's with the person that she loves, and he sees that as being fair, perfectly pure and good, that she is this kind of iconic, virginal almost woman at this point. Okay. And here's where the action happens. As you know, this is my favourite poem. Kind of a shocking thing. We know that he's mentioning her hair numerous times, but then he winds it round her throat and he strangles her. So a very shocking turn of events, really. The fact that he calls it a thing to do is so casual in tone. It's like an activity he's doing to pass the time. He debates what he's going to do, and then what does he choose? He chooses to murder her in a violent and terribly aggressive way. We've got here this casual mention of what he does. I wound 3 times her little throat around and strangled her. It's just so matter of fact. It's these material verbs, wound, strangled, later on oped. It's his verb. All the verbs are ascribed to him. It's his agency, his choice to act. But the casual tone of it is so factual. It's all in declarative sentence forms. Yeah, and I killed her. It's just a real insight into his madness and into his thought processes. And Browning really emphasises that through those verb choices and those sentence forms. The fact he calls it her little throat, there's a sort of diminutive adjective there. It makes her seem weak, it makes her seem vulnerable. But again, remember, that's from his perspective. He says, no pain felt she. I'm quite sure she felt no pain. No pain felt she is subverted syntax. She has no agency there. He's kind of trying to tell us that, in his opinion, it was okay because it didn't hurt her. He says, I'm quite sure she felt no pain. And that choice of sure there is very interesting, because it's actually impossible for him to know. And we want to know, who's he trying to convince? Is it trying to convince himself? Is he justifying his actions? She didn't feel anything, so it was okay that I did it. Okay. He then opens her eyelids. Again, laugh the blue eyes without a stain. It's as if he's frozen her at a happy moment, this idea of staining something that's a permanent mark that we don't want. He says there's no stain there of worry about going back to her usual life. The removal of the stain of her sexual impurity. She's never going to be called out as this impure woman. So she can just laugh and be happy, and laugh the blue eyes, that happiness, that innocence coming through there. He untightened next the tress. Now, I think that's quite interesting, because tress does mean hair. However, all the way through, he's mentioned her yellow hair. Sorry, my hand's shaking because I'm holding my camera too long. He's mentioned her hair, and yet here he switches to tress. So the hair is just suddenly gone, vanished. He no longer mentions it, so it loses its importance. It makes us realise that its only importance was as her murder weapon. And then here, blushed bright beneath my burning kiss, on line 48. We've got this burning indicating kind of passion. There's no cold now. He's not cold anymore. At the start, there was all references to rain. The grate was cheerless because there was no fire in it. He was cold. Now he's burning, he's passionate, and it's using that plosive alliteration, blushed bright beneath my burning kiss. So it's kind of harsh, but that emphasises the passion that he's feeling at this point, ironically after she's dead. I propped her head up as before, only this time my shoulder bore her head. So he, sickeningly, props her up as if she's alive, and then he indicates that this has changed their relationship. She was the one who moved his head to her shoulder at the start. She had the power and the agency, perhaps because of her social standing, perhaps because of her nature as a woman, as a seductress. Doesn't really matter why, she has the power, whereas at this point, it's his shoulder that holds her head. He has the power. He can prop her up. He can pose her, control her completely and utterly. He literally can change the way she sits, because she's no longer alive. to have her own agency and her own decisions. And then he says that the smiling, rosy little head, again, that diminutive language, smiling, rosy little head. She's powerless. There's a string of pre-modifiers there, smiling, rosy, little. It's a girlish image, but we've got to remember it's not virginal, okay? One of the main messages of this poem is that kind of seductive nature of her as a woman. And then he says, so glad it has his utmost will, that all it scorned is at once is fled, and I its love am gained instead. He's justifying his decisions there. So glad. So it's as if her head is glad that it's had its will, the thing it most wanted in the world. The thing it most wanted in the world, he says, is him. What we've got to bear in mind is in order for her to be with him completely, he feels he had to kill her. And then he says, and I, its love, am gained instead. That exclamatory choice of sentence type there, that happy and ecstatic tone that she can have him now. She's so lucky because now in her death, she doesn't have to worry and she can have him and be in love with him. But of course, we all the time realise that that's very sinister. She's had to die for that. Her darling one wish would be heard, the one thing she wanted. The irony is that we never hear her express this wish. She never says, I want to be with you forever. It's him and his voice supposing that that is what she wanted. We don't know if that's what she wanted. We can assume that she didn't want to die in order to achieve that. And thus we sit together now. We've got this temporal shift there. There's a shift in tense, you'll notice. So it's she guessed not how, we sit together. There's a shift in tense. We realise here that she's been dead since before our speaker started telling the story. That story was all in past tense. So we can't hear her voice. It's impossible for us to hear her voice. We can only hear his voice because she's been dead the entire time. It's his story. It's his narrative. Again, I said to you with the My Last Duchess video, it's that homodiegetic narrative, that dramatic monologue structure. It's his voice and his story, not hers. And the last couple of lines there, that couplet, and all night long we have not stirred, and yet God has said not a word. It's like they're frozen in time. He's chosen a time when she worshipped him, or he viewed it that way. Not love, of course, remember, worship. And that's the point, he's chosen to freeze in time. And then there's a reference right at the end to God. Perhaps that's a moral reference. Is he right to do what he did? He clearly believes so because God's not spoken out against him. Is there a message here that sexualised women are better off dead? I don't know, but it does feed into that Victorian prudishness. There's, of course, all the way through that semantic field of love, the kiss, the smiling, the darling. But that contrasts so strongly with the reality of the situation, and we need to be aware of that all the way through. Now, the structure of this poem is perhaps something you've not come across before. So it has a rhyme scheme of A, B, A, B, B, and there's often 8 syllables per line. There are a few lines where that doesn't quite fit. That's called iambic quadrimeter. So you've done iambic pentameter, that's where there's 5 feet in a line. A quadrimeter has 4 feet in a line, 8 syllables. Remember, there's 2 syllables per a foot when we talk about poetry. Although it's all in one long dramatic monologue, because of that rhyme scheme, it divides it into cinquains, which end in couplets. So there's a lot of emphasis on those couplets, those final rhymes. And to read, it appears to be like a normal speech pattern, but it's actually really highly structured. The pattern, though, is asymmetrical. It's not A, B, A, B, A, B, it's A, B, A, B, B. And that's kind of intense, and it perhaps reveals the barely concealed madness in the speaker and through his voice. So we could comment on the structure in that respect. Thank you.